The battle for the Orion Nebula was chaos incarnate. Brilliant streaks of light filled the void as human starfighters clashed with the jagged warships of the Draconis Federation. The Earth Federation fleet was caught off guard, ambushed during a routine patrol, and the Draconian forces showed no mercy. Amidst the chaos, Captain Eric Talon fought with unparalleled skill, his sleek fighter, the Horizon Blade, weaving through enemy formations like a shadow. Eric's reputation preceded him. He wasn't just a pilot, he was a legend among his peers, a man who had turned the tide in countless battles. But even legends weren't invincible. As he maneuvered to protect a retreating medical transport, a plasma lance from a Draconian destroyer struck his ship. The blast crippled his engines and left his navigation systems in disarray. Alarms blared in the cockpit, red lights bathing him in a hellish glow. "Damn it!" Eric muttered, his hands flying over the controls. The Horizon Blade shuddered violently as he initiated emergency protocols. He tried to redirect power to the engines, but the damage was too severe. The enemy ships closed in, their shadowy forms growing larger on his cracked view screen. In a final act of defiance, Eric activated the ship's self-destruct mechanism, intending to deny the enemy any chance to capture him or the classified data stored in his fighter. But as he reached for the final override, a pulse of energy surged through the cockpit, shorting out the controls. His hands went numb, and the screens around him flickered before going dark. The last thing he saw was a Draconian boarding pod latching onto his hull. Eric woke to the sensation of cold metal beneath him and the distant hum of alien machinery. His head throbbed, and his limbs felt heavy. He opened his eyes to find himself in a dimly lit chamber, the air thick with a faint metallic tang. Restraints bound his wrists and ankles, and alien symbols glowed faintly on the walls around him. "Ah, the infamous Captain Talon," a guttural voice echoed. Eric turned his head to see a towering Draconian warrior standing before him, its scaly features twisted into a sinister grin. Its armor gleamed in the dim light, and its reptilian eyes studied him with a mix of curiosity and disdain. "You'll find me less cooperative than you'd hope," Eric said, his voice hoarse but defiant. The Draconian chuckled, a deep, rumbling sound. "Cooperation is irrelevant. You are nothing more than a trophy now, a symbol of your kind's futility." It leaned closer, its breath hot and rancid. "We have a special place for prisoners like you. A place where defiance turns to despair." Eric didn't flinch. He met the alien's gaze with unyielding determination. "We'll see about that." The Draconians wasted no time. Eric was marched through the bowels of their colossal warship, his every step shadowed by heavily armed guards. The ship's corridors were vast and alien, pulsating with an organic quality that made his skin crawl. He passed rows of cells filled with other prisoners, human and alien alike, each one looking more broken than the last. Yet Eric's resolve only hardened. Finally, they reached a large, reinforced door. Strange glyphs etched into its surface glowed ominously, and the air around it seemed to shimmer with heat. One of the guards pressed a clawed hand to a control panel, and the door slid open with a heavy hiss. Beyond it was darkness, broken only by the faint glimmer of something massive moving within. Eric was shoved forward, his restraints removed as the guards retreated. The door slammed shut behind him, leaving him alone in the cavernous cell. For a moment, silence reigned. Then, from the shadows, came a low, rumbling growl that vibrated through the floor. Eric's eyes adjusted to the dim light, and he saw it, a creature of immense size and terrifying beauty. Its scales shimmered like liquid starlight, and its eyes burned with an otherworldly glow. The Nebula Drake. Eric's heart pounded, but not with fear. He recognized the creature instantly from his studies, one of the apex predators of the Draconis Federation's homeworlds. The beast snarled, its maw revealing rows of serrated teeth. Most would have cowered, but Eric stood his ground, his mind racing. He understood its posture, the subtle flick of its tail, the way its head tilted as it sized him up. This wasn't a mindless monster, it was a thinking, feeling creature, and it was deciding whether Eric was prey or something else entirely. Eric slowly raised his hands, palms open, and spoke softly, not in words, but in sounds and gestures he had learned during his years of research. The nebula drake paused, its growl subsiding into a curious rumble. Its luminous eyes narrowed as it studied him. For the first time since his capture, Eric allowed himself a small smile. The Draconians had thrown him into their deadliest cell, but they had no idea they'd given him an opportunity. The nebula drake loomed in the dimly lit cell, its massive form partially obscured by shadows. Its glowing eyes locked onto Eric, radiating an intelligence that surprised him. Every instinct told him to run, but there was nowhere to go. Instead, he stood his ground, exhaling slowly to steady his nerves. The creature shifted, the ground trembling beneath its weight. Its breath came in deep, rasping waves, carrying a faint sulfuric tang. It didn't immediately attack, which Eric took as a good sign. He had spent years studying creatures like this during his time as an exobiologist before becoming a pilot. This wasn't just a predator, it was a highly intelligent apex species. Eric crouched slightly, adopting a posture that conveyed he wasn't a threat. He avoided direct eye contact, knowing it could be interpreted as a challenge, but kept the creature in his peripheral vision. His hands remained visible, palms facing out, a universal gesture of peace among many species. The nebula drake tilted its head, a low rumble emanating from its throat. Its tail flicked once, the sound of it cracking against the metallic floor echoing through the chamber. Eric took a cautious step forward, his heart pounding. He mimicked the creature's rumble as best as he could, a deep vibration that resonated in his chest. The drake paused, its eyes narrowing slightly, and Eric saw a glimmer of something curiosity. The cell was vast, far larger than Eric had anticipated. The walls were reinforced with strange, glowing glyphs that he assumed were a combination of technology and arcane science, designed to contain the beast. The air was thick and humid, carrying the scent of charred metal and something earthy, almost organic. Eric's gaze shifted to the far end of the chamber, where he spotted a pile of debris-shredded metal, fragments of armor, and what appeared to be the skeletal remains of previous prisoners. The drake had clearly been well-fed, but Eric noted with relief that it didn't seem particularly hungry at the moment. The hours stretched on, and Eric continued his careful attempts to communicate. He made low, guttural sounds that mimicked the drake's vocalizations, interspersed with subtle gestures that indicated submission. Slowly, the creature seemed to relax. It lowered its massive head, its nostrils flaring as it sniffed the air around him. Eric's instincts kicked in. He knelt and extended a hand, palm down, allowing the creature to inspect him. The drake's head moved closer, its glowing eyes unblinking. It sniffed him cautiously, its warm breath washing over him. Then, with a suddenness that made Eric flinch, it pulled back and let out a short, sharp growl. "Easy," Eric murmured. "I'm not here to hurt you." The drake tilted its head again, its luminous eyes reflecting a mix of curiosity and suspicion. Eric took this as a small victory. He settled onto the floor, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. If he was going to survive, he needed to do more than coexist with the creature. He needed to earn its trust. Days passed, and a tenuous understanding began to form between man and beast. Eric observed the creature's behavior closely, noting patterns in its movements and vocalizations. He realized that the nebula drake was more than a mindless killer. It was a prisoner, like him, confined and used as a tool of fear by the Draconians. The drake seemed to appreciate Eric's presence in its own way. When it ate, tearing into the slabs of meat the Draconians dropped through a chute, it no longer growled at him. It even allowed him to approach while it fed, a sign of growing trust. Eric used these moments to study the creature up close, noting the intricate patterns on its scales and the faint, bioluminescent glow that pulsed along its body. One night, as Eric sat against the cold wall of the cell, the drake approached him unbidden. It lowered its massive head to his level, its glowing eyes mere inches from his face. Eric froze, every muscle in his body tense. The creature let out a deep, rumbling sound, not a growl, but something softer, almost like a purr. Tentatively, Eric reached out and placed a hand on its snout. The drake didn't pull away. "Good," Eric whispered, his voice barely audible. "We're in this together, aren't we?" Meanwhile, outside the cell, the Draconian guards observed the interaction with growing alarm. The Nebula Drake had never shown anything but hostility to previous prisoners, yet it hadn't killed this human. In fact, it seemed almost docile. "What do you make of it?" one guard growled, his claws tapping against the console. "It's unnatural," another replied, his scaly brow furrowed. "The human must be manipulating it somehow." The first guard bared his fangs in frustration. "If he survived this long, he might be more dangerous than we thought. The Overseer needs to know." Back in the cell, Eric and the Nebula Drake continued their silent partnership. The creature had started responding to his command's subtle gestures and vocal cues that Eric had refined over the days. He knew their bond wasn't perfect, but it was enough to give him an idea. If he could communicate with the Drake, perhaps he could convince it to help him escape. As he rested his hand against the Drake's warm scales, Eric's mind raced with possibilities. The Draconians had underestimated him, thrown him into their deadliest cell thinking it would be his end. But Eric had always thrived in impossible situations. The Nebula Drake let out a low growl that reverberated through the chamber, and Eric smiled faintly. "They don't know who they're dealing with," he muttered. "But they will soon." Eric awoke to the soft vibration of the Nebula Drake's low growl reverberating through the chamber. The creature loomed nearby, its glowing eyes fixed on the heavy metal door that separated their cell from the rest of the Draconian warship. It seemed restless, its massive tail flicking against the floor in sharp, deliberate movements. Eric had come to recognize this behavior. It was agitated, sensing something in the air. "You feel it too, don't you?" Eric murmured, his voice calm despite his own unease. Over the past days, their uneasy alliance had transformed into something more. The Nebula Drake had become less a captor and more an ally, a fellow prisoner with a mutual understanding. Eric had earned its trust through patience and careful observation, proving to the beast that he was neither a threat nor an adversary. In turn, the Drake had allowed him closer than any human had ever been to one of its kind. Eric sat cross-legged on the floor, a rough plan forming in his mind. He knew that whatever uneasy peace they had achieved wasn't sustainable. The Draconians were watching, and their patience would run out. If he and the Drake were to escape, it would have to be soon. The next day's cycle marked by the dim, pulsing lights that passed for timekeeping in the alien prison brought a development that Eric had anticipated. The metal door hissed open, and two Draconian guards entered, their weapons drawn. They carried a massive metal crate filled with fresh meat, which they dumped unceremoniously on the floor near the Drake. The smell of raw flesh filled the chamber, but Eric barely flinched. "Still alive, human?" one of the guards growled in a voice thick with disdain. "Enjoy your last days. The Overseer has plans for you." Eric didn't respond, keeping his gaze steady as the guards retreated. He had no intention of giving them the satisfaction of seeing his unease. Once the door slammed shut, he turned his attention back to the Drake, which had already begun tearing into its meal. "Overseer, huh?" Eric muttered to himself. "Sounds like they're running out of patience." The Nebula Drake paused mid-bite, its luminous eyes locking onto Eric. It let out a short, sharp growl, and Eric frowned. He had come to recognize that sounded wasn't a threat, but a warning. "You're right," Eric said, standing slowly. "They're up to something." He approached the creature cautiously, his movements deliberate. Over the days, he had learned to interpret its body language, and now it seemed almost eager, as if sensing the urgency of the situation. He reached out, placing a hand on its snout. The Drake rumbled softly, a sound that Eric had come to interpret as approval. "All right," he said. "Here's the plan." Eric had spent hours studying the cell structure. The glowing glyphs on the walls were some form of containment technology designed to suppress the Drake's abilities. But Eric had noticed that the glyphs flickered intermittently, particularly after the Draconians brought in the food crate. He theorized that the glyphs drew energy from the warship's main systems, and the interruptions suggested a point of vulnerability. "The next time they come, we make our move," Eric whispered to the Drake, gesturing to the far corner of the cell where the glyphs flickered most frequently. "I'll distract them, and you break through that section. If we hit it hard enough, I'm betting it'll overload." The Drake tilted its head, its glowing eyes narrowing. Eric mimicked the plan with hand gestures, hoping to convey the sequence clearly. To his amazement, the creature rumbled in understanding, its tail flicking once a signal he had come to interpret as agreement. The opportunity came sooner than expected. The metallic doors slid open once more, and this time, 3 guards entered, their weapons raised. One of them stepped forward, barking orders in their guttural language. "You're being moved," the lead guard growled in broken human speech. "The overseer wants to see you." Eric tensed but masked his fear with defiance. "What? No farewell gift? I was just getting comfortable." The guard snarled, shoving him forward. Eric stumbled but kept his footing, his mind racing. This was his moment. He glanced at the Drake, which had risen to its full, imposing height. Its scales shimmered faintly, the bioluminescence pulsing faster than usual. It was ready. As the guards turned their attention to Eric, he made his move. With a sharp whistle signal he had trained the Drake to recognize, he ducked low, rolling out of the way. The Nebula Drake let out an earth-shaking roar, its wings unfurling as it charged toward the flickering section of the cell's wall. The sound was deafening, and the guards barely had time to react before the creature struck. The impact was catastrophic. The wall buckled under the force of the Drake's massive frame, and the glowing glyphs sputtered violently before shattering in a shower of sparks. The air filled with the acrid smell of burning circuitry as the containment system collapsed. "Move!" Eric shouted, sprinting toward the breach. The Nebula Drake followed, its movements fluid and terrifyingly powerful. Alarms blared throughout the ship as the two escaped into the dark, labyrinthine corridors. The Draconians scrambled to contain the breach, but they were unprepared for the sheer ferocity of the Nebula Drake. It tore through bulkheads and defenses with ease, its roars echoing like thunder. Eric kept close, using his knowledge of Draconian ship design to navigate toward the hangar bay. As they reached the hangar, Eric spotted what he had been hoping for, a sleek Draconian shuttle, its engines idling. He climbed aboard, the Drake following closely. The controls were alien but intuitive, and within moments, he had the engines roaring to life. "Hold on," he shouted as the Drake settled in the cargo hold, its massive frame barely fitting. The shuttle lurched forward, blasting through the hangar doors and into the vast expanse of space. As the warship receded behind them, Eric allowed himself a rare moment of relief. The Nebula Drake let out a low, triumphant rumble, its glowing eyes fixed on the stars ahead. "Not bad, huh?" Eric said, glancing back at his unlikely ally. The creature rumbled again, this time softer, almost approving. They were free for now. But Eric knew their journey was far from over. Together, man and beast had defied the odds, and as they hurtled toward the unknown, Eric couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope. The Draconians had underestimated them, and now they would face the consequences. Close enough to make the hull shudder. The Drake let out a low, guttural roar, its frustration mirroring Eric's own. "I know," Eric snapped. "I'm working on it." As the Draconian fighters closed in, Eric's comm system crackled to life. A gruff, heavily accented voice barked orders in Draconian, no doubt demanding his surrender. He ignored it, his focus on weaving through the onslaught of firepower. Suddenly, a new signal lit up on the scanner, a large formation of ships emerging from hyperspace. Eric's heart leapt as he recognized the configuration. The Earth Federation fleet had arrived. The lead Earth ship, the massive Aegis broadcast its presence with a thunderous volley of firepower, scattering the Draconian fighters like leaves in a storm. Eric slammed the comm switch. "This is Captain Eric Talon, broadcasting on all Earth Federation channels. Shuttle ID unknown, but friendly. Do not engage." A moment of static passed before a familiar voice replied. "Talon? Is that you? This is Commander Reyes aboard the Aegis. Thought we'd lost you." "Not yet," Eric replied, his grin sharp despite the chaos. "But I've got some cargo you're going to want to see. And a lot of angry Draconians on my tail." The Aegis launched a squadron of fighters to intercept the pursuing Draconians. Eric watched as Earth's pilots engaged with precision, creating an opening for his shuttle to dock. He guided the battered vessel into the Aegis's hangar bay, the ship's systems groaning under the strain of the maneuver. As the shuttle's landing gear touched down, Eric sprang from the cockpit, his boots hitting the metal deck with a thud. A team of soldiers approached, weapons drawn, their faces a mixture of confusion and alarm as they caught sight of the Nebula Drake emerging from the cargo hold. The creature unfurled itself with a guttural growl, its glowing eyes scanning the unfamiliar surroundings. The soldiers froze, their rifles trained on the beast. "Stand down!" Eric barked, stepping between the Drake and the soldiers. "It's with me." "With you?" Commander Reyes strode into the hangar, her expression a mix of disbelief and anger. "Talon, what the hell is that?" Eric held up a hand to calm her. "A Nebula Drake. It's intelligent, and it's on our side. It helped me escape that Draconian prison, and it's the reason I'm still alive." Reyes glared at him, then at the Drake, which let out a low rumble but made no aggressive moves. After a tense moment, she lowered her weapon. "This better be one hell of a story." "Oh, it is," Eric replied. "But first, we need to get out of here." The Aegis wasted no time retreating, its engines roaring as it jumped to hyperspace, leaving the Draconian fleet in disarray. In the ship's briefing room, Eric recounted his ordeal, from his capture to his bond with the Nebula Drake. Reyes and the other officers listened in stunned silence, their skepticism giving way to fascination as Eric described how he had survived by earning the creature's trust. "This changes everything," Reyes said once Eric finished. She leaned back in her chair, her eyes narrowing thoughtfully. "If what you're saying is true, and this thing is as intelligent as you claim, we might have a chance to turn the tide." Eric nodded. "The Draconians use these creatures as weapons, but they don't understand them. They see them as tools, not allies. If we can communicate with the Drakes, maybe even form alliances, it could shift the balance of power." Reyes glanced at the massive observation window, where the Nebula Drake was visible in the hangar, its luminous eyes scanning its new surroundings. "It's risky," she said. "But if we're going to win this war, we need every advantage we can get." The Drake proved its intelligence over the following days, adapting quickly to life aboard the Aegis. Eric continued to serve as its intermediary, teaching the crew how to approach it and understand its behavior. Slowly, the creature became more than just an ally, it became a symbol of hope. News of Eric's escape and the Nebula Drake's defection spread rapidly through Earth's forces, igniting a surge of morale. Scientists and military strategists began working with Eric to unlock the potential of forging alliances with other intelligent species in Draconian space. In the war's darkest hour, Eric and the Nebula Drake became legends. Together, they led daring raids on Draconian strongholds, their bond an unstoppable force. The image of a human riding a Nebula Drake into battle became a rallying cry for Earth's forces, a symbol of unity and resilience. As the war raged on, Eric stood on the bridge of the Aegis, watching the stars blur into streaks of light as the ship jumped to its next mission. Beside him, the Nebula Drake rested, its bioluminescent glow casting a faint light across the room. "They didn't know who they were dealing with," Eric said softly, a hint of satisfaction in his voice. The Drake rumbled in agreement, its eyes gleaming with shared determination. The Draconians had underestimated them both, and now the tides of war were turning. Together, man and beast had become an unstoppable force, an alliance forged in the unlikeliest of places, destined to change the fate of the galaxy.